Back in 1985, my wife and I made a bet on our wedding night. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Jack, if you can put up with me for 40 years, I'll give you something that seems impossible." I laughed it off as just another one of Catherine's wild, playful moods. We never brought it up again. Last month, in 2024, she passed away exactly 40 years to the day. Yesterday, while the dirt on her grave was still fresh, a lawyer I'd never seen before knocked on my door. He handed me an old brass key, an address in the Scottish Highlands, and a note. It simply read, "You won the bet, Jack. Go alone. Trust no one, not even our children." When I finally reached Scotland and turned that key in the lock, I realized I had been living with a stranger for 4 decades. And as for my kids, they didn't come to the funeral to mourn, they came to hunt. My name is Jack Reynolds. I'm 71, and I spent my life as a structural engineer. I made a career out of ensuring Seattle's skyscrapers wouldn't crumble under pressure. I can spot a hairline fracture in concrete before an entire building comes down, but somehow I couldn't see the cracks in my own home until the day I buried my wife. If you're new here, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. It really helps this old man share his story with the world. Also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. I love reading where you're all tuning in from. The sound of wet earth hitting a casket is something you never forget. It's a final dull thud that feels like a period at the end of a sentence. But for my son, Brian, and my daughter, Emily, that wasn't a closing sound. It was the starting gun. The funeral service had barely ended, and guests were still pulling out of the driveway in the rain, when I found myself standing in my kitchen, staring at a sink full of dirty dishes. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from a hollow, crushing grief, the kind that makes you feel like your chest is caving in. Catherine was my anchor. Without her, I felt like I was drifting out to sea. I walked into the living room, expecting to find my kids crying, or at least sharing memories of their mother. Instead, I saw Brian pacing, his phone pressed hard against his ear. He's 42, an entrepreneur, which is a polite way of saying he's started 6 companies and I've had to bail him out of 6 bankruptcies. He was running his hand along the mantelpiece, not with affection, but like he was appraising the timber. "Yeah, it's a massive lot," he said into the phone. "The land alone is worth $2 million, easy. I'll have it listed by Monday. We just need to clear out all the old junk." I froze in the doorway. My wife had been in the ground less than 2 hours, and my son was already calculating the profit from selling her home. Emily was on the sofa, scrolling through her tablet. She's 38, a real estate agent who drives a Porsche lease she can't afford. She looked up at me, her eyes dry, devoid of tears, but sharp with calculation. "Dad," she said, her voice dripping with a dangerous kind of sweetness. "Brian and I were thinking, this place is way too big for you now. All these stairs, the maintenance, it's actually a safety hazard. We found this amazing assisted living facility downtown. It's got ocean views and 24-hour care. You'd love it." I looked at them, really looked at them. I could practically feel the greed radiating off them like heat. They didn't care about my safety. They cared about the equity in this house. I built this place with my own hands in 1990. I designed the load-bearing walls. I reinforced the foundation. I know every beam, every screw, and they wanted to liquidate it to cover their own messes. I knew Brian owed money to some very bad people because of his gambling, and I knew Emily was drowning in credit card debt just to keep up her socialite persona. I took a deep breath. "I'm in mourning," I said, my voice raspy. "I'm not an invalid. I'm not selling the house." Brian hung up the phone and turned around, his expression hardening. "Come on, Dad. Let's be realistic. Mom is gone. You're 71. You're going to start forgetting things. Maybe you'll leave the stove on. We're just trying to protect our inheritance. I mean, protect you." He'd slipped up. He said the quiet part out loud, "our inheritance." I was about to throw them out when a heavy knock echoed at the front door. It was strange. Everyone else had already left. I turned my back on the kids and walked to the door. Outside, it was pouring. Classic Seattle weather. Standing on the porch was a man I didn't recognize, soaking wet, wearing a trench coat that looked like it belonged in a different century. He held a briefcase tight against his chest. "Mr. Reynolds, he asked, his accent thick and Scottish. I nodded. Yes? He didn't come in. He peered over my shoulder, caught sight of Brian and Emily, and lowered his voice to a whisper. My name is Hamish McAllister. I'm your wife's attorney. Not the family lawyer, her private one. I frowned. Catherine didn't have a private lawyer. We shared everything, or so I thought. She gave me strict instructions, he continued, water dripping from his hat. I was to deliver this only after the funeral, and only when you were alone. But I see you have company. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy envelope sealed with wax. He pressed it into my hand. It felt cold and heavy. Hide it, he whispered. Don't let them see it. Don't let them know I was here. Read it when they're gone. Why? I asked, completely confused. Because, Jack, he said, his eyes as dark and sharp as the storm behind him, the woman you married was not who you thought she was. She was protecting you. Now you have to protect yourself. With that, he turned and vanished into the rain as quickly as he'd appeared. I stood there for a moment, the envelope feeling like it was burning a hole in my hand. I could feel a hard object inside, a key. I tucked it into my inner jacket pocket, right against my heart. My pulse was racing. I turned around. Brian was standing right there. He'd crept up behind me. He was standing way too close, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto the bulge in my pocket. Who was that at the door, Dad? Brian asked. His tone was casual, but his body language was predatory. Just a neighbor offering condolences, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. A neighbor? Brian scoffed. In a trench coat? Who doesn't come inside? What did he give you? Nothing, I said. Just a sympathy card. Brian took a step closer, holding out a hand. Let me see. I'll add it to the stack. We need to keep a record of who sent what for the thank you notes. I took a step back. I've got it, Brian. Go take a seat. Emily stood up from the sofa. The air in the room shifted. The awkwardness had curdled into something hostile. They were like wolves who had caught the scent of blood. Dad, Emily said, her voice sharp, why are you acting so weird? Did Mom have a secret account? Is that what that is? Did she leave cash? There is no cash, I snapped. Brian sneered, a sound with no warmth in it. You're lying. I can tell. Your left eye twitches when you lie. Hand over the envelope, Dad. Technically, I'm the executor of the estate, so I have the right to view all financial documents. You aren't the executor, I said, my anger finally overriding my grief. I'm still here, Brian. Everything is mine. Brian's face turned bright red. He looked at Emily, then back at me, taking another step forward. For the first time in my life, I felt physically threatened by my own son. He was taller than me, younger, and desperate. I clutched my chest, feeling the brass key through the fabric. I realized then that McAllister was right. I didn't know my wife, but worse, I didn't know my children. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever felt like a stranger in your own home? Like the people you raised turned into people you don't even recognize? If you felt that, hit the like button so I know I'm not alone. I looked Brian straight in the eyes, summoning every ounce of authority I'd built up over 40 years of managing construction crews, and pointed to the door. Get out, I said. Brian blinked, stunned by my tone. What? Get out, I repeated. Both of you, go home. I need to mourn my wife in peace. Brian balled his fists. He took one last look at my jacket pocket. He was weighing his options. Attacking me would be assault, so he decided to wait. He flashed a fake, rigid smile that made my skin crawl. Sure, Dad. Sure, we'll go. We're just worried about you, that's all. You're clearly under a lot of stress. We'll be back in the morning to help sort through Mom's things. We really need to find those bank statements. They grabbed their coats. As they walked out the door, Emily looked back. Don't do anything stupid, Dad. Mom would have wanted us to handle the money. She knew you were getting frail. The door clicked shut. I locked it, threw the deadbolt, and slid the security chain into place. I slumped down against the door, sliding to the floor. The house was silent again, but now that silence felt heavy with secrets. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. My hands shook as I broke the wax seal. A heavy brass key clattered onto the floor. It looked ancient. I unfolded the note. It was Catherine's handwriting, the familiar loops and curves I'd known for 40 years. Jack, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and if I've calculated correctly, the vultures are already circling. I read the letter in the dim light of the hallway. Every word felt like a hammer striking my reality. She mentioned a bet. She mentioned a life I knew nothing about. Then I read the final line. They are watching you, Jack. Check the smoke detector in the hallway. I looked up. The smoke detector was blinking a tiny red light, a rhythm that wasn't normal. I stood up, dragged a chair over, and climbed up. I unscrewed the casing. Tucked behind the battery was a micro camera and a microphone. I nearly fell off the chair. My own children had bugged my house. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Brian. Get some rest, Dad. See you in the morning. Don't lose that envelope. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. Not tonight, maybe not ever. If they knew about the envelope, they wouldn't stop until they had it. I looked at the key, then at the address in Scotland. I grabbed my passport from the desk drawer. I didn't pack clothes or toiletries. I just took my medication, my wallet, and that key. I slipped out the back door into the rain, leaving my car in the driveway to make them think I was still inside. I walked 3 blocks to a gas station and used a payphone to call a cab. To the airport, I told the driver. Where are you flying to? He asked. As far away from my family as possible, I whispered. But as the taxi sped toward the airport, I had no idea Brian had installed a tracker I didn't even know about. My escape was about to become a hunt. We drove in silence. I watched Seattle roll by, the cafe where Catherine and I had our first dates, the park where I taught Brian to ride his bike, the mall where Emily would throw fits until I bought her that prom dress. Memories flickered by like a sad movie reel. When I hit the airport, I paid in cash. I tossed the SIM card from that Nokia into a trash can outside the terminal and bought a new one from a vending machine. Paranoia is a survival skill, I told myself. I cleared security without a hitch. To the world, I was just a retiree heading on vacation. I bought a one-way ticket to Glasgow, with a layover in London using a credit card I'd opened in my own name years ago, a card Brian didn't even know existed. As the plane roared to life and the force of the takeoff pressed me into my seat, the feeling was surreal. For the first time, I let my shoulders drop. We climbed into the dark, punching through the rain until we were above the storm, the moonlight hitting a sea of white clouds. I looked down. Seattle was just a grid of golden lights fading into the distance. Down there in that dark house, my original phone was still plugged into the wall, waiting for a morning alarm I would never hear. Brian was probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of how rich he'd get by selling off my life. I reached into my inner pocket for Catherine's letter. I'd only read the first part. As the cabin lights dimmed and the engine drone drowned out the world, I unfolded the second page. Her handwriting grew shaky toward the end. Jack, she wrote, you must be angry. You must be wondering why I made that bet. Why I made you wait 40 years. It wasn't just a joke. It was a test. I knew if I gave you this secret too early, you would have used it to save the kids. You would have bailed Brian out of his first bankruptcy. You would have cleared Emily's debts. You're too kind, Jack. And in the face of parasites, kindness is just a weakness. I paused, taking off my reading glasses to wipe away a tear. She knew me too well. The letter continued. The key I gave you opens a door to the past, to 1985, specifically. While you were busy building bridges, I was weaving a safety net for you. Go to the Scottish Highlands. Find the cellar behind the old bookshelves. But be careful, Jack. What you find down there isn't just a fortune. It's a burden. It requires you to be the man I always knew you could be. Don't be the nice guy. Be a warrior. You won the bet, my love. Now go take your prize, and for the love of God, do not drink the bottle labeled 1985 unless you are ready to go to war. I folded the note. A cellar, a bottle from 1985, and a warning to become a warrior. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. The nice guy had been left behind in Seattle, still plugged into a wall charger. The man flying to Scotland was different. He was ready for the war. The plane's landing gear slammed onto the tarmac in Glasgow, the jolt vibrating through my teeth. I hadn't slept in 9 hours. My body felt heavy and fragile, like drywall soaked in water. I clutched my duffel bag to my chest through the terminal, my eyes scanning the crowd by habit. I was half expecting to see Brian or Emily standing there with a sheriff and a court order, but there were only strangers with placards, none bearing my name. I rented a car, a silver hatchback that smelled faintly of wet dog and old tobacco. For a man who'd driven on the right for 50 years, driving on the left was a nightmare. But fear is a better fuel than caffeine. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, pointing the nose north. The drive was no scenic vacation, it was a journey into desolation. As I left the city, the landscape shifted. Rolling green hills turned into jagged black peaks that pierced the low gray clouds. The rain here was different from Seattle's. It wasn't a gentle constant. It was aggressive, driven by gale-force winds that howled like a wounded animal, hammering sideways against the windshield. I drove for 4 hours. The roads narrowed until they were single-lane ribbons, winding through endless bogs and heather. No houses, no gas stations, just sheep standing by the road, watching me with their cold, rectangular pupils. The isolation began to seep into my marrow. I felt tiny against such a landscape, an aging fugitive in a rental car, chasing a promise made by a dead woman in 1985. My GPS finally pinged. "You have arrived at your destination." I stopped. I looked out the window and my heart sank. There was nothing, just a rusted wrought iron gate, hanging off its hinges, leaning against a crumbling stone pillar. A faded wooden sign lay in the mud, barely legible. Altmore Manor. I pulled into the gravel driveway, or what was left of it, and the tires skidded in the muck. I drove slowly, the tangled branches of ancient trees clawing at the roof like skeletal fingers. Then the house came into view. I cut the engine and just stared. If this was the prize, the game was a scam. The building was a ruin. It looked like a small castle or a large estate house, built of gray stone seemingly quarried from the surrounding mountains. But it was dying. Thick green moss crawled over the walls like a disease. The roof had collapsed in the center, a clear sign of failing support beams. Some windows were boarded over with gray, rotting plywood. One of the chimneys had partially crumbled, leaving a pile of rubble on the lawn. I'm a structural engineer. I don't see houses, I see skeletons. This building was on life support. I stepped out of the car and the wind immediately tried to knock me over. I pulled my coat tighter and walked toward the front door, my boots squelching in the mud. I looked up at the facade. I saw water stains. I saw rising damp. I saw 50 years of neglect. "Catherine," I whispered into the wind, "what on earth did you do? Was this her revenge? Was the impossible thing just a bottomless pit? A final burden to crush me before I died?" Bitterness surged in my chest. I'd left my comfortable home, my paid-off mortgage, my warm bed, for this? A pile of wet stones in a country that never saw the sun. I almost turned back. I almost got in the car and drove to the nearest airport to fly home and face my kids. At least the nursing home Emily wanted to shove me into had central air and a roof that didn't leak. But then I felt the weight of that brass key in my pocket. It rested against my hip, feeling surprisingly warm. Go alone, trust no one. I climbed the stone steps to the front door. They were slick with algae. The door itself was massive, made of dark oak and reinforced with iron strapping. It looked like the only solid thing in the entire house. I took out the key. My hands were shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. I looked at the keyhole. It was large, complex. I slid the key in. It fit perfectly. I'd expected it to jam, expected the mechanism to have rusted solid after 40 years. I'd even braced myself to ram it with my shoulder. But the key turned with a smooth, satisfying click. The mechanism had been oiled, recently. I frowned. That was impossible. The gate was trash. The driveway was a disaster. The windows were boarded up. Who oils the locks on a ruin? I pushed down the handle. The heavy oak door swung inward silently on perfectly lubricated hinges. I stepped across the threshold, bracing for the smell of mildew and rat droppings. I expected darkness. I expected it to be colder inside than out. Instead, I gasped. The air that hit me was warm. Very warm. It was filled with the scent of burning pine, expensive beeswax polish, and something else. Roasted meat, rosemary, and thyme. I blinked, trying to let my eyes adjust. I was standing in a grand foyer. The floor wasn't rotting wood, but polished black and white marble, gleaming under the light of a massive crystal chandelier. The walls weren't covered in moss, but paneled in warm, lustrous mahogany. I walked further in, my muddy boots echoing in the silence. To my left, through a massive archway, was a living room. A huge stone fireplace dominated the wall, with a roaring fire casting dancing shadows. The floor was covered in Persian rugs. The leather armchairs looked soft and inviting. The plywood I'd seen on the windows from the outside was hidden here behind heavy velvet curtains. This was a sanctuary, a fortress disguised as a ruin. I stood there, stunned by the divide between the outside and the inside. Catherine hadn't bought a wreck. She'd bought a hidden hideout, a place that looked worthless to the world, but was palatial inside, just like her. She never wore jewelry. She drove a 10-year-old car, but she had a heart of gold and apparently a hidden fortune. "Is anyone there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. No answer, only the crackle of the fire and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Drawn by the warmth, I moved toward the fire and held my hands out. On a small table beside a leather armchair sat a tray. On it was a crystal decanter, filled with an amber liquid and a glass. Beside the glass was a folded note. I picked it up. It wasn't Catherine's handwriting. It was neat, sharp, and businesslike block lettering. "Welcome home, Mr. Reynolds. Have a whiskey. You look like you need it. I'm in the kitchen. Don't come in yet. I'm reducing the sauce." My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. Someone had been waiting for me. Someone had lit the fire. Someone was making dinner. I looked down the hall toward the back of the house. A shadow moved against the wall. A large shadow. "Who are you?" I shouted, backing toward the door. A deep voice came from the hall. It sounded like coarse gravel grinding together. "I am your insurance policy," the voice said. Heavy footsteps began to bear down on me. Thump, thump, thump. I gripped that heavy brass key in my hand like a weapon. I didn't know if I was about to meet a friend or an executioner. But one thing was certain. The game Catherine started 40 years ago was far more complex than I'd imagined, and the players were already in position. Tell me in the comments, if it were you, would you bolt out the door or stay to face this stranger? Because I stayed, and the presence that stepped out of the shadows was the last thing I could have expected. Hit that like button if you want to see who's hiding in this castle. The massive figure stepped out of the shadows, and the firelight illuminated a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was an older man, perhaps my age, but built like a longshoreman, shoulders broad, hands like shovels. He wore an immaculate black suit, the fabric strained tight across his chest. He didn't attack. Instead, he bowed deeply, an old-school gesture that felt wildly out of place in this crumbling castle. I lowered the brass key I'd been holding like a dagger. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice echoing in the vast room. He didn't answer. He tapped his throat with two thick fingers and shook his head. He was a mute. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, laminated card. I took it. It read, "My name is Angus. I am the caretaker of Outmore Manor. I cannot speak, nor can I hear, but I am an expert lip reader. When you speak to me, please face me. Mr. McAllister sent me to serve you." I looked at Angus and nodded. The tightness in my shoulders eased a fraction. "I'm Jack," I said, enunciating clearly. "I think you know why I'm here." Angus smiled, a warm expression that softened his rugged face. He gestured for me to sit in one of the leather armchairs and brought the tray closer. It was a steaming plate of rich venison stew. I realized then that I hadn't eaten since the funeral reception. I devoured the food while Angus stood by the fireplace, adding logs with rhythmic precision. When I finished, Angus tapped my shoulder. He pointed down the hall and made a gesture like opening a book. He wanted me to follow him. We walked through the silent house. The juxtaposition was jarring. The hallways were drafty and smelled of damp earth, but every room we passed was pristine. We arrived at double doors. Angus pushed them open to reveal a library that would have put university archives to shame. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were packed with leather-bound books. A sliding ladder sat in the corner. Angus walked to a specific section of the shelves. He pointed to a book on the third shelf. I squinted to read the spine. The Count of Monte Cristo. A lump formed in my throat. It was Catherine's favorite book. She loved that story of patience and delayed justice. I tugged at the book. It didn't pull out. Instead, there was a click. A mechanical latch released with a dull thud. That entire section of the bookshelf swung outward silently, revealing a spiral stone staircase descending into the dark. Cold air wafted up, carrying a scent I recognized instantly. Oak, vanilla, and the sharp bite of alcohol. The angel's share. Angus handed me a flashlight and gestured for me to go down alone. He remained at the top of the stairs like a sentinel. I descended. The steps were carved from solid rock. As I went deeper, the air felt controlled. I noticed humidifiers and temperature sensors on the walls. This wasn't a dungeon, it was a climate-controlled vault. I reached the bottom and hit a wall switch. Rows of industrial fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating a space that took my breath away. It was a cathedral of wood. Rows of oak barrels stretched into the darkness, stacked 3 high on brand-new steel racks. I walked down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing on the concrete. I ran my hand over the rough surface of the nearest barrel. Stamped on the side in black ink was a date, 1985. I moved to the next barrel, 1985. The next, 1985. They were all from 1985. I reached the end of the row where a dusty little desk sat. On it was a leather-bound ledger and a pile of files. I opened the ledger. It was Catherine's handwriting. October 1985. Purchased 500 barrels of new-make spirit from the soon-to-be-closed Altmore Distillery. Price, $100 per barrel. 50 years of storage paid in advance. I flipped the pages. For 40 years, she'd tracked evaporation rates, temperature fluctuations, and flavor profiles. Every time she told me she was going on a yoga retreat or a trip with friends, she was coming here. While I was patching bridges in Seattle, she was building a massive legacy in Scotland. I picked up the top file from the stack. It was an appraisal from a prestigious whiskey auction house, dated last month. Item: Altmore Reserve, 1985, single malt. Status: extremely rare. Distillery dismantled in 1986. This is the last remaining stock in the world. Estimated auction value, $60,000 per barrel. I dropped the paper. My knees buckled, and I grabbed the edge of the desk to stay upright. I did the math in my head. $60,000 times 500 barrels. $30 million. I laughed. It was a dry, hysterical sound that echoed off the stone walls. My wife, the woman who clipped coupons for laundry detergent and fought with the cable company over a $10 fee, had been sitting on $30 million. She made a bet that if I could put up with her for 40 years, she'd give me the impossible. She gave me financial freedom. She gave me a kingdom. I looked around the room with new eyes. This wasn't just alcohol. This was power. This was the leverage I needed to start my life over. I reached for a bottle on the desk labeled Sample Barrel Number 1. I pulled the cork and took a sniff. It smelled like honey, dried fruit, and victory. I was just about to pour myself a taste when a piercing buzz shattered the silence. It was the red light flashing at the top of the stairs, an alarm. I scrambled up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I burst into the library. Angus was by the window, holding a tablet. His face was grim. He turned the screen toward me. It was a live feed from the front door security camera. A black SUV was tearing up the muddy driveway, forcing its way through the overgrown branches. It screeched to a halt in front of the manor, spraying mud onto the stone steps. The doors opened. First came the driver, a brute in a cheap suit, looking like a hired heavy. Then a man I knew all too well stepped from the back seat. Brian. He looked different than he had at the funeral. He wore a tactical jacket and hiking boots, his face twisted with a roaring sort of determination. He was pointing at the house, shouting things I couldn't hear. The other door opened. Emily stepped out. She clutched her designer handbag, looking at the mud with disgust, but her eyes were just as resolved. Finally, a third man appeared, tall, lean, with silver hair and a briefcase. I'd seen him on the news, a top American attorney known for aggressive estate litigation. They had found me. I looked at Angus. "How?" I asked. "How did they find me so fast?" Angus tapped the screen, pointing to the timestamp in the corner. They hadn't just found me. They'd been tracking me from the moment I landed. Brian charged up the steps and slammed his fist against the heavy oak door. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. "Open the door, Dad!" Brian shouted, his voice muffled through the wood. "We know you're in there. We have a court order. Open up, or we're kicking it in." I looked up at him, my breath hitching, feeling the cold, hard wood of the chair digging into my back. Brian stood over me, his face a mask of distorted rage, the pen still leveled at my chest like a shiv. "Last chance, Dad," he snarled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Sign the papers, or you're never seeing the sun again." I didn't answer. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I slowly pushed my glasses back up the bridge of my nose and shifted my gaze past him, toward the shadows near the entrance. Angus was still there. He had been standing perfectly still, his massive frame like a statue in the gloom. But as I looked at him, I gave a single, imperceptible nod. Brian noticed the change in my focus and turned his head, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you looking at? You think that mute is going to help you? He's on the payroll now." He turned back to me, about to grab my arm to force the pen into my hand, when the silence of the cellar was shattered. It wasn't a shout. It was the mechanical thud-clack of the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs, the one Brian had dismissed as a way to keep me trapped. It had just been locked from the outside. Brian froze. "What was that?" He spun toward the staircase. "Hey, who's up there?" Silence. Just the low, steady hum of the climate control system and the sound of our breathing. Then the rhythmic, heavy sound of footsteps began to descend the stone stairs. Thump, thump, thump. These weren't the quiet, shuffling steps of an old man. They were heavy, deliberate, and carried the weight of someone who knew exactly who they were and why they were there. A figure emerged from the shadows at the base of the stairs. It wasn't Angus. It was a man I'd never seen before, dressed in a heavy, dark coat that smelled of damp wool and rain. He held a thick manila folder in one hand. Behind him, 2 local police officers in high-visibility vests stood on the stairs, their hands resting on their belts. "Mr. Brian Reynolds," the man said, his voice clipped and formal with a Scottish burr. "I am Inspector MacLeod of the Highland Police. We've been expecting you." Brian's face drained of all color. He dropped the pen. "The police? You can't be here. We're in a private vault. We're conducting business." "You're conducting a hostile takeover involving kidnapping, physical intimidation, and a fraud scheme that spans 2 continents," the inspector replied, his eyes scanning the cavernous room filled with 500 barrels of history. He turned his gaze to me, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. "Mr. Reynolds, we received the documentation, the ledger, and the security footage you sent to my office 3 days ago. Your wife, Catherine, was a very thorough woman. My knees felt weak, and for the first time in 24 hours, the weight in my chest actually lightened. Catherine hadn't just left me a fortune. She'd left me a trap for them." "How?" Brian whispered, looking between me and the inspector. "How did he contact you?" "That, Mr. Reynolds, is where your hubris failed you," the inspector said, stepping closer. "You tracked his phone, but you didn't check the house's landline, or the prepaid burner phone he used to alert us the moment he stepped off the plane. Your father isn't a senile old man. He is a master structural engineer, and he spent the last 3 days watching you dismantle yourselves." The officers moved past the inspector, their presence filling the air with the authority of the law. They didn't look at the whiskey. They looked at the people. "Brian Reynolds, Emily Reynolds," the inspector continued, his voice hardening, "you are both under arrest." Emily let out a shrill cry, collapsing against a barrel, her designer coat dragging in the dust. "Dad! Tell them this is a mistake. We're your children." I stood up slowly, steadying myself against the desk. I looked at Brian, my son, the man who had promised to leave me in the dark to rot for the sake of a few $1,000,000. "You're right, Brian," I said, my voice steady, echoing in the vast, silent room. "You aren't killing me, but you did just finish the structural demolition of your own lives." As the officers moved in, their handcuffs clicking with a sound that felt like the final gear locking into place, Brian looked at me, not with regret, but with pure, unadulterated shock. He finally realized that the old man he'd been trying to manage had been the one pulling the strings all along. The inspector turned to me. "We have a secure transport waiting outside, Mr. Reynolds. and a legal team standing by to handle the transfer of these assets into your sole trust. You are safe now. I looked around the Cathedral of Barrels, at the history, the legacy, and the proof of Catherine's love. I'd walked into this cellar expecting to be the victim, but I was leaving as the survivor. I turned to the inspector. "There is one thing I need to do before we leave," I said, gesturing to the open bottle of 1985 Reserve on the desk. I picked up the glass. I didn't drink it. I walked over to where my son stood, his wrists already shackled behind his back, looking smaller and more pathetic than I'd ever seen him. I looked him in the eye one last time. "You wanted your inheritance, Brian?" I said softly. "This is it, the truth, and it's the only thing you're ever going to get from me again." I poured the amber liquid onto the cold stone floor at his feet, the rich, expensive scent filling the air as it vanished into the dirt. Then I turned my back on them and walked toward the stairs, leaving the wreckage of my family behind in the dark, and stepping out into the cold, clean air of the Highlands, a free man. If you've stuck with me through this, you know that the greatest construction project you will ever take on isn't a building. It's your own life. Never let anyone, not even your own blood, convince you that your foundation is weak. If you want to know what I did with the $30 million and how I rebuilt my life after the trial, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The story is only just beginning. "Emily!" I shouted, pushing past Brian to call out to my daughter. "Emily, did you hear what he just said? He's talking about ending my life. You need to do something." Emily stood right next to the lawyer. She was eyeing the barrels, doing some quick math in her head. She looked at me, frail and aging in that chair, and then she looked at Brian, who was gripping his pen like a weapon. She didn't flinch. She didn't come to my defense. She smoothed out her silk scarf, eyeing me with an expression of pure, cold boredom. "Dad," she said, her voice sharp as glass, "cut the drama. Nobody is going to harm you. Just sign the papers. We need this money. I have a massive payment due on my house next week. Brian has predatory lenders breathing down his neck. We're out of options, and you're just sitting on a fortune playing the martyr. If you sign, we can all go home. Don't make this any harder than it has to be. Don't force our hands," Brian added, towering over me. He slapped the documents onto the desk in front of me with a sharp crack, followed by the pen. "Sign it!" he barked. I looked at the documents. I looked at the pen. Then I looked at Angus, standing in the shadows. His fists were clenched, waiting for my signal. Brian didn't even know he was there. He was so blinded by greed that he'd completely forgotten about the giant in the corner. I reached for the pen. My hand was shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was from a searing, molten rage. They wanted me to sign. They wanted to take everything. I took a deep breath and looked up at Brian one last time. "Do you want it that badly?" I asked softly. "Is the money worth all of this to you?" "Yes," Brian gritted out. "I'm taking back what's mine." I gripped the pen, but I didn't move it to the paper. I glanced at Angus and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was set. It was time to close it. But before I tell you what happened next, I have a question for all of you. If your own children threatened you like this, would you ever forgive them? Or would you make sure they learned a lesson they'd never forget? Let me know in the comments. And if you're ready to see a bully get exactly what's coming to him, hit that like button. Brian reached out to grab my hand and force me to sign, but he never even touched me, because from the shadows a hand the size of a dinner plate shot out and clamped onto the back of his tactical jacket. Then the screaming started. At my command, Angus released his grip. My son collapsed to the floor, gasping for air and clutching the back of his neck where the giant had held him. The tension in the cellar was thick enough to cut. But as I looked at the three of them, my gasping son, my terrified daughter, and the calculating lawyer, I realized that physical force wasn't the answer. If I let Angus throw them out, they'd just return with the police, or worse, with the dangerous people Brian owed money to. No, I needed to end this for good. I needed to destroy every bit of leverage they had, and the only way to do that was to let them destroy themselves. I slumped back into my wooden chair, letting my body go completely limp. I let my hands shake, clutched my chest, and played the part of the frail, dying old man they desperately wanted me to be. "Angus," Stand down, I whispered, my voice raspy and weak. I can't fight them. Look at them. They're young. I'm just too tired. Brian scrambled to his feet, eyes darting between me and Angus. He looked like a cornered rat. But when he saw me sagging like a deflated balloon, his arrogance returned. He straightened his jacket, trying to regain his dignity. You made the right choice, Dad, Brian said, his voice still shaky but finding its edge. You almost made a huge mistake, letting your guard dog come after me. That's assault. We can add that to the list of reasons why you need to be placed in a facility. I closed my eyes and let out a heavy, wheezing breath. Water, I rasped. Please, my throat. I need water before I sign. Emily sighed impatiently, but she walked over to the small sink in the corner, used for rinsing glasses. She filled a cup and thrust it toward me. She didn't hand it over gently, she practically shoved it in my face. Here, she snapped. Drink it and sign. We don't have all night. I took the cup with both hands, intentionally spilling a little on my shirt to sell the performance. I drank slowly, watching them over the rim of the glass. Mr. Sterling, the lawyer, was reorganizing the papers on the desk, smoothing out the creases. He looked nervous, checking his watch repeatedly. I set the cup down. I'll sign, I said quietly. I'll give you the whiskey. I'll give you the house. I'll give you the power of attorney. Brian clapped his hands together, the sound echoing off the stone walls. Finally! Thank God you've come to your senses. But, I said, raising a trembling finger, I have one condition, one question. I'm your father. I changed your diapers. I put you through college. I carried you on my shoulders. If I'm going to sign away my life and Catherine's legacy, I deserve the truth. None of those lies about protecting my health. Why do you need this money so badly? Why today? Why is it a matter of life and death? Brian looked at the lawyer, who gave a slight shake of his head, warning him to stay silent. But Brian was high on adrenaline and the prospect of $30 million. He felt invincible. He looked at me with a mix of pity and contempt. You want to know? Brian stepped forward and leaned in until his face was inches from mine. You want the truth? Fine. I owe people money. Not a bank, not a credit card company. I owe private investors in Las Vegas. They are very dangerous people. How much? I asked. $5 million, Brian whispered. I lost it all. Every cent. I thought crypto would bounce back, but it crashed. They've only given me until Monday. Do you know what happens on Monday if I don't pay? They won't send a collection agency. They'll send cleaners. They'll end me, Dad. They'll tear me apart. A chill went down my spine. My son wasn't just a failure. He was tied up with organized crime. And you, Emily? I looked at my daughter. You don't gamble. Why are you here? Emily crossed her arms, defensive. I'm not like him, she said, pointing at Brian. My problem is temporary. I borrowed some money from a company escrow account. The market took a hit, and I needed to keep up appearances. The Porsche, the apartment, the club memberships. I thought I could put it back before the audit. She bit her lip, looking away. The audit is next Tuesday. If I don't replace that $600,000, I'm going to prison. I'll lose my license. My life will be over. I see, I said calmly. You aren't here to save me. You're here to use my whiskey to cover your crimes. You're trying to use this sanctuary to launder money. It's not money laundering, Brian retorted, spraying spit. It's survival. We sell the barrels to Sterling's private buyer network in Hong Kong. Cash transaction, untraceable. We clear our debts, and we still have $20 million left to live like kings. And you? You can retire in a luxury facility and never have to worry about anything. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. I believe the sharing session is over. Mr. Reynolds, please sign here, here, and here. He pushed the documents toward me. The power of attorney, the property deed transfers, the irrevocable trust agreement. I looked at them. They were my death warrant, but they were also the evidence I needed. Brian and Emily had just confessed to extortion, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit money laundering, all in front of a witness. They just thought that witness, Angus, was deaf and mute. They thought I was defenseless. What they didn't know was that the pen in my pocket wasn't just a pen. It was a high-fidelity digital recorder, the same one I'd used 10 years ago to catch a corrupt foreman stealing copper wire. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the pen. It was the Mont Blanc silver fountain pen Catherine had given me for our 25th anniversary. I discreetly clicked the top, ensuring the recording light was covered by my thumb. I leaned over the desk. My hand hovered over the signature line. Brian was breathing heavily behind me. I could smell his sweat, a mix of fear and greed. Emily was tapping her foot in a rhythmic, impatient beat. "Sign it, Dad," Brian urged. "Just put your name on the line and it's all over." I looked at the document. I looked at the line marked Grantor's signature. I thought of the 40 years Catherine and I had spent building our lives. I thought of the sacrifices, the late nights, the missed vacations. Then I thought of the betrayal and the sheer moral rot standing in front of me. I pressed the nib to the paper. I didn't sign Jack Reynolds. I wrote slowly and deliberately, carving each letter into the paper so deeply it almost tore the fiber. Seyouyinhell. I lifted the pen and looked at the words. I stood up. The performance was over. The trembling stopped. The weakness vanished. I stood to my full 6-foot height, with the posture of a man who had carried the weight of the world his entire life, and was finally setting it down. "What's taking so long?" Brian reached for the papers. "Let me see that." He snatched the document. He looked at the signature line and froze. He squinted, thinking he'd misread it. He brought the paper closer to his face. "See you in hell," he read aloud, his voice thick with confusion. "What is this supposed to mean?" I smiled. A genuine, heartfelt smile. A cold, dangerous smile. "It's a message, Brian," I said, my voice steady and booming through the cellar. "And it's the only thing you're getting from me." Brian snapped his head up, his face twisted in ugly rage. "You think this is funny, you old man? You think this is a game?" He crumpled the paper into a ball and threw it at me. "Angus!" he roared at the giant in the shadows. "Grab him! Make him sign! Break his fingers if you have to!" But Angus didn't move to grab me. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made the blood drain from Brian's face. It wasn't a weapon. It was a badge, a police badge. Suddenly, the lights in the cellar flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. If you saw that coming, let me know in the comments. If you're cheering for Jack right now, hit that like button, because the turnaround is going to make your head spin. The darkness that descended on the cellar was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating pitch black you only experience buried deep underground. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the ventilation system and my son's rapid, jagged breathing. The badge in Angus's hand was the last thing Brian saw before the lights went out, an image that must have been seared into his retina like a ghost. Then chaos erupted. I heard Brian scream, a primal, animalistic roar of frustration and rage. I heard his heavy boots pounding on the concrete floor, charging toward where I sat. Even though he couldn't see, he knew where I was. He was coming to finish his task, to get his hands around my throat before the law could touch him. I sat there frozen, gripping the arms of my wooden chair. I didn't run. I didn't even flinch. Because I knew something Brian didn't. I knew Angus wasn't just a caretaker. He was a retired detective inspector from the Glasgow police. And right now, he was standing like a stone wall between me and my son. In the dark, there was a sickening thud of bodies colliding, followed by the muffled groan of air being forced out of a chest. Brian had slammed full tilt into Angus. I heard a body hit the floor hard. "Get off me!" Brian screamed, his voice filled with terror. "Get off me, you monster!" Then the lights came back on. But this wasn't the warm, yellow fluorescent glow from before. It was the harsh, white, tactical floodlights that had been hidden in the corners. They washed out all color, leaving the room feeling like a sterile, cold operating theater. I blinked, shielding my eyes. When my vision cleared, I saw a scene I would remember for the rest of my life. Brian was pinned face down on the floor. Angus had one knee on Brian's back and a hand locked onto his wrist, in a hold that looked painful enough to break bone. Brian was struggling wildly, cursing, but he was completely powerless. Emily had been pushed into a corner, pressed against a stack of whiskey barrels, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. She looked like a child caught stealing, only this jar was worth $30 million, and the penalty was prison. Mr. Sterling, the lawyer, had dropped his briefcase. He stood with his hands high in the air, shaking. He knew the game was over. He knew that as an accomplice to extortion on foreign soil, the American legal immunity he thought he had meant nothing here. Just then, the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs banged open. Disciplined, synchronized footsteps echoed down the spiral stone staircase. Hamish McAllister walked into the cellar. He wasn't wearing his old trench coat anymore. He was in a sharp, gray suit, moving with the authority of someone in total control. Behind him were 4 uniformed police officers, their high-visibility vests jarringly bright against the gray stone walls. McAllister didn't even look at the lawyer. He walked past the trembling Emily and straight to the desk where I sat. He looked at the crumpled ball of paper on the floor with "See you in hell" written on it. He picked it up, smoothed it out, and laid it gently on the desk. Then he turned to face everyone in the room. "Gentlemen," McAllister said, his voice calm and resonant, "and Ms. Reynolds, I believe the negotiations for this evening are over." Brian groaned from the floor, trying to lift his head. "You set us up," he spat, blood on his lips from where he'd hit the floor. "This is entrapment. You can't do this. I want my lawyer." McAllister smiled, a cold, shark-like smile. "You have a lawyer, Mr. Reynolds. He's standing right there with his hands in the air. Though, looking at the sweat on his forehead, I don't think he's in a position to help you much." But Brian wasn't done. He was desperate. He started screaming, spewing lies. "They attacked me. My father has dementia. He attacked me, and this man attacked me. I'm the victim here. We were just having a family discussion about finances." McAllister reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote. He pointed it at the speaker system mounted on the wall above the barrels. "A family discussion," McAllister repeated. "You call this a family discussion? Let's review the meeting minutes." He pressed the button. The sound that filled the room was crystal clear. It was the high-fidelity audio from my Mont Blanc pen, transmitted in real time to McAllister's receiver upstairs. My own voice played from the speakers, weak and trembling. "Why do you need this money so badly? Why today?" Then came Brian's voice, arrogant, unhinged, and undeniable. "I owe people money. $5 million. They're dangerous. They'll kill me, Dad. They'll tear me apart." Brian stopped struggling on the floor. He went completely still. The recording continued. Emily's sharp, cold voice rang out. "If I don't replace the $600,000 I took, I'm going to prison." Then the final nail in the coffin. Brian's malicious voice again. "If you don't sign, I'm leaving you here. I'll let you rot and stink in the cold." McAllister pressed the button again, and the silence that followed was deafening. Their own confessions echoed in the air, heavy and fatal. There was no room for spin. There was no context that could excuse it. They hadn't just threatened their father. They had admitted to multiple felonies on tape. McAllister looked down at Brian. "Extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and death threats. In Scotland, we take these things very seriously, Mr. Reynolds." He nodded to the officers. 2 large, stoic-faced policemen stepped forward. They hauled Brian up from the floor. He tried to break free, but they slammed him against the nearest whiskey barrel. "Brian Reynolds," one of the officers said in a heavy, authoritative Scottish accent, "I'm arresting you for extortion and assault. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned, something which you later rely on in court." The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting tight was the sweetest thing I'd ever heard. Click, click, click. It was the sound of my freedom. It was the sound of the chains that had bound me finally being cut. Brian looked at me, his eyes wild. "Dad, tell them it was just a joke. You can't let them take me. They'll put me in a general cell. I won't survive. Dad, please." I looked at him. I looked at the boy I'd raised. The boy I'd spent my life protecting, shielding him from every consequence. I'd paid his parking tickets. I'd paid his rent. When he was arrested for a bar fight in college, I'd paid his bail. I'd stood between him and the rest of the world. But by doing that, I had created the very monster that thought it could devour me. I stood up slowly. My legs felt strong. I walked over to where he was pinned against the barrel and looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm not your victim anymore, Brian," I said softly. "And I'm not your savior either. You're a grown man. You made your bets, and now you have to pay the price." I turned my back on him. "Take him away," I told the officers. As they dragged him toward the stairs, Brian began to scream. He screamed curses, he screamed for mercy, he screamed for his mother, but I didn't turn around. Then the officers turned toward Emily. She shook her head, backing away until she hit the wall. "No," she sobbed. "No, I didn't threaten him. That was Brian. I was just trying to borrow money. I'm a mother. You can't arrest me. I have children waiting for me in Seattle." McAllister walked up to her. "You admitted to embezzlement on the tape, Miss Reynolds, and you stood by, watching your brother threaten to end your father's life. You even encouraged him. That makes you an accomplice and a conspirator in extortion." He gestured to the remaining officers. As they grabbed her wrists, Emily shrieked. It was a piercing, bone-chilling sound. "Don't touch me! This coat is Chanel! You're hurting me, but Dad, help me!" I watched them cuff her. I watched the cold steel lock around her wrists. I thought about the syringe she'd tried to put into my arm and the brochure for the care home in her bag. "You should have thought more about your children, Emily, before you tried to drug your own father," I said. They led her past me. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "I will never forgive you for this," she shrieked. "You are dead to me." I looked at her with sorrow. "You've thought I was dead for a long time, Emily. I was just a walking checkbook to you. Well, that checkbook is closed for good." Mr. Sterling, the lawyer, was the last one left. He calmly held out his hands, trying to salvage a final shred of dignity. "I demand to contact the American consulate," he said, his voice trembling. McAllister laughed. "Oh, don't worry. We'll contact them. I'm sure the American Bar Association will be very interested in hearing how you assisted your clients in orchestrating a hostile takeover of a vulnerable elderly man's assets. I suspect you'll have your license revoked before your plane even lands." The officers took him away. I stood alone in the center of the cellar with only McAllister and Angus. As the sounds of my children being dragged up the stairs faded away, the silence returned to the room. But this silence wasn't heavy. It was light. It was clean. McAllister walked over to the barrel where the bottle of 1985 whiskey still sat. He picked up the shards of the glass I'd smashed earlier and sighed. Then he found a clean glass on the shelf and poured a full measure of the amber liquid. He handed it to me. "Your wife told me you were a man of great patience, Jack," McAllister said. "She said you would wait until the very last second to strike back. She was right." I took the glass. My hand was steady now. "She also asked me to give you this," McAllister said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. Inside wasn't a large key, but a simple, small silver one, much smaller than the brass one. "What is this?" I asked. McAllister smiled, pointing to a small metal safe welded to the back of the steel frame behind the first barrel. "The final piece of the puzzle," he said. "She said after the storm had passed you'd need it." I walked to the safe, inserted the silver key, and turned it. Inside sat nothing but a single old VHS tape. The label was handwritten, simply reading, "For Jack." I looked over at McAllister. "There's a VCR in the library upstairs," he said. I nodded. I downed the rest of the whiskey, letting the fiery heat burn away the last lingering chill I'd felt when I saw my children in handcuffs. "Let them go," I said. "I want to hear what she has to say to me." I followed him up the stairs, leaving the $30 million behind in the dark. In that moment, I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to see my wife one last time. At the top of the stairs, the heavy oak doors were still open, ready to swallow my children into the judicial system. But McAllister raised a hand, signaling the officers to wait. There was one last matter of business, one final truth that needed to be spoken aloud, not just for the court records, but for the soul of this family. "Wait," McAllister said, his voice commanding the room. "Before you take them, there is one more document they need to hear. This is an addendum to Catherine Reynolds' last will and testament." Brian stopped struggling. He looked back at us, his face slick with sweat and blood, but a flicker of hope still lingered in his eyes. Maybe he thought there was a legal loophole. Maybe he thought his mother, despite everything she had witnessed, had still left him a safety net. Emily stopped sobbing, hiccuping loudly as she looked at the lawyer with wide, desperate eyes. McAllister opened the leather folder he'd been carrying and put on his reading glasses. The cellar fell into a deathly silence, broken only by the hum of the ventilation system, keeping those $30 million of assets cool. Clause 42, McAllister read, his tone formal and grave, also known as the wager. He looked over his spectacles at Brian and Emily. Your mother wrote this clause 20 years ago, he said. She updated it every year on her birthday. She knew you better than you knew yourselves. He turned his gaze back to the document and began to read. If upon my passing my husband Jack Reynolds has survived our 40-year marriage, then he has won this wager. However, the distribution of the Alt-Apine assets shall depend entirely upon the conduct of our children. Brian leaned forward, desperately trying to break free from the officer's hold. What does it say? He demanded. McAllister ignored the interruption and continued. Scenario A. If Brian and Emily treat their father with love, respect, and dignity during his time of grief, the assets shall be divided into 3 equal parts. 1 for Jack, 1 for Brian, and 1 for Emily. I heard Emily let out a sharp, choked gasp. She crumpled against the wall, sliding down to her knees. $10 million. She had thrown away $10 million just because she couldn't wait 1 week, because she couldn't pretend to be a decent human being for just a few days. McAllister raised his voice slightly, ensuring every word landed like a hammer blow. Scenario B. If Brian and Emily attempt to obtain these assets through coercion, manipulation, intimidation, or harm to their father in any way, their inheritance shall be immediately and irrevocably forfeited. Brian's face went white. No, he whispered. That's not legal. You can't just kick us out like that. I'm not finished, McAllister said sharply. Scenario C. If Jack Reynolds is physically harmed, or if he is declared mentally incompetent under false pretenses initiated by his children, the entire inventory of Alt-Apine 1985 stock shall be uncorked and poured into the River Spey. Not a single drop is to be sold. Silence descended on the room. Even the police officers looked stunned. It was the ultimate scorched earth policy. Catherine would rather destroy this massive fortune than let it fund her children's greed. Brian stared at the lawyer, his mouth hanging open. She was insane, he stammered. She wouldn't do that. She loved us. McAllister snapped the folder shut. She loved the children she raised, he said. She didn't love the predators you became. She protected Jack from you. And tonight, you proved her right. Brian's face twisted again. The shock turned back into fury. He lunged forward again, fighting the handcuffs, veins bulging in his neck. You can't do this to me, he screamed, his voice echoing through the stone arches. Dad, look at me. I'm your son. I'm your only son. You can't let them put me in prison. You can't keep all this money. This is blood money. He was crying now, those ugly, desperate tears mixed with snot and blood. Dad, please. I made a mistake. I was out of options. Don't let them ruin my life. I'm your kid. Remember fishing by the lake? Remember my graduation? I'm your son. I stood there, feeling a sharp pain in my chest, more intense than any heart attack. I looked at the man screaming before me. I tried to see the little boy with the scraped knees I used to know. I tried to see the teenager who dreamed of being an astronaut. But all I could see was the man who had tried to commit his own father to a psychiatric ward. All I could see was the stranger who had threatened to end me for a few barrels of alcohol. I walked slowly toward him until I was just out of his reach. I looked deep into his eyes, searching for any trace of the son I had once known. But there was nothing there. Only greed, only fear, only an empty shell. I don't have a son, I said quietly, my voice low but trembling with the weight of the truth. Brian stopped screaming. He stared at me blankly. I used to have a son, I continued, a tear finally sliding down my cheek. He was kind. He was funny. But he died a long time ago. I don't know who you are, but I know what you are. You're a man who tried to put his father in a mental institution. You're a man who threatened to kill me over a barrel of whiskey. I stepped back and turned my back on him. Take them away, I said. Brian began to scream again, a shrill, desperate wail as the officers dragged him toward the stairs. You'll rot in hell, you old man. I hate you. I hope you die alone. Emily didn't scream. She just kept her head down, crying silently as she was led away. She didn't look at me. The shame had finally become real. I stood there listening to their footsteps fade up the spiral staircase. I listened to the heavy steel door bang shut. I listened to the locking mechanism engage, sealing that world away for good. Then there was silence, absolute overwhelming silence. I looked at McAllister. He was busy packing up his files, giving me a moment of solitude. Angus had already faded back into the shadows. I was alone with $30 million. I had won the wager. I possessed wealth beyond my wildest dreams. But I felt more bankrupt than I ever had in my life. My legs finally gave out. I slid down, sitting on the cold concrete floor. I leaned my back against a barrel labeled 1985 and buried my face in my hands. I didn't cry because I was afraid. I didn't cry because I was relieved. I cried because I had failed. A father's job is to raise good men, strong women, and to bring good people into this world. I had built skyscrapers that could withstand earthquakes. I had built bridges that carried millions, but the most important structure I ever built, my family, had come crashing down. I sobbed, my body shaking with grief. I cried for Brian. I cried for Emily. I cried for the sweet children they used to be and the terrible monsters they had become. But mostly I cried for Catherine, because she had seen all of this coming 40 years ago, and I had been blindly oblivious until it was far too late. I sat there for a long time, letting the grief wash over me. The money didn't matter. The castle didn't matter. At that moment, I would have traded every drop of whiskey in this cellar for a family that actually loved me. But we can't bargain with fate. We can only play the hand we are dealt. After a while, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was McAllister. He didn't say anything. He just handed me a handkerchief. I wiped my eyes and looked up at him. "It's over," he said softly. "Yes," I said, "it's over." "But it's not entirely finished," McAllister said. "You still have one tape left to watch, and I think she left you one last surprise." I nodded slowly, pushing myself up from the floor. My bones ached, my heart ached, but I was standing. "I'm ready," I said. "If you think I was too harsh on them, or if you believe I did what had to be done, let me know in the comments. Hit subscribe, and let's watch the final message my wife left for me together. It changes everything." After the police left, a heavy silence settled over the cellar, but it was the clean silence that follows a storm. The air no longer smelled of fear and sweat, only of damp stone and the sweet, sleeping aroma of aging whiskey. McAllister didn't rush me. He poured himself a small glass of the '85 vintage and stood near the stairs, giving me the dignity to compose myself. I wiped my face with the handkerchief he'd given me. The tears had dried, replaced by a cold numbness that I knew would eventually harden into a scar. I walked to the desk where the crumpled "See you in hell" note still sat. That wasn't just a message for my son. It was a message for the old me. The Jack Reynolds who used to take things lying down was dead. Standing in the cellar now was a brand new man. McAllister placed a new stack of documents on the desk. These were different from the ones Brian had tried to force me to sign. These were legal affidavits for criminal proceedings. "We have some decisions to make, Jack," McAllister said, his voice gentle but professional. "The police are handling them. Brian is looking at immediate extradition proceedings back to the U.S. Federal authorities have already flagged his passport due to his outstanding debts and his known connections to Las Vegas organized crime syndicates." I looked at McAllister. "What happens to him when he gets back?" I asked. McAllister took a sip of his drink. "He will be in federal custody, but given the nature of his creditors, I suspect his time in prison might be the safest days of his life. If he is bailed or released, the people he owes $5 million to will be waiting for him, and those people aren't known for their patience." I pondered his words. I imagined my son facing the sharks he'd invited into his life. The part of me that was still a father wanted to ask McAllister if we could just pay off his debts. $5 million was a drop in the bucket compared to the $30 million in this room. I could save his life with a single signature. I could erase his mess. But then I remembered the look in Brian's eyes when he'd told me to rot in the cold. I remembered he'd been willing to end me just to save himself. If I bailed him out now, I wouldn't be saving him. I'd just be teaching him that his actions have no consequences. "Send him back," my voice was steady. "Do not pay his bail. Do not pay for his lawyers. If he needs a lawyer, he can use a public defender. He always wanted to be a big player in the underworld. Now he can live in it. McAllister nodded and made a note in his pad. And Emily? I sighed. Emily, while less violent, was perhaps more insidious. She had used a position of trust to steal money from innocent people. Contact the Washington State Real Estate Licensing Board, I said. Send them the recording of her confession and copy it to her firm's executives. Her license must be revoked. She must never be allowed to touch anyone else's money again. It sounds cruel, I know, but as a structural engineer, I understand that if you find a rotten beam, you can't just paint over it. You have to saw it out before it brings the whole house down. Emily has to hit rock bottom before she can ever climb back up. I'm not destroying her life. I'm stopping her from destroying others. Now, McAllister closed the folder on my children, we need to discuss the practicalities. You currently own a very expensive, highly vulnerable asset. We need security. We need staff. And we need cash flow immediately to pay for all of this. I looked around. I had $30 million in potential wealth, but less than $2,000 in my checking account. I was asset rich, cash poor. Sell the first 10 barrels, I said. McAllister raised an eyebrow. So soon? I nodded. I want it handled by tomorrow morning. Contact the Hong Kong buyer Brian mentioned, or use your own network. I don't care who buys them as long as the check clears. I need liquidity to fortify this castle. I want a full security team. I want cameras in every corner. I want a new gate. I want this cellar locked down so tightly that even a ghost would need a password to get in. McAllister smiled. You're thinking like a businessman now, Jack. Catherine would be proud. He made a call right there in the cellar, speaking in rapid-fire legal jargon mixed with figures. Less than 20 minutes later, he hung up. Done, he said. A private collector in London agreed to purchase 10 barrels of the Altabhain 1985 at $60,000 a barrel. He is wiring the funds to the escrow account I set up for you. Within an hour, you will have $600,000 in available capital. $600,000. In my old life, that was 10 years of salary. Here, it was just 10 barrels of whiskey. The reality of my new life began to settle in. I was free. I could go anywhere. I could do anything. But the only thing I wanted to do was finish what was in front of me. I walked down the long aisle of barrels, counting as I went. We marked 10 barrels with chalk. As I reached the end of the row, I found myself standing in front of barrel number 1. It was different from the others. The wood was darker, older, and where the other barrels emitted a faint, sweet aroma of alcohol evaporation, this one seemed sealed, tighter. I ran my hand over the lid. Taped to the top was something, a small rusted key. I picked it up. It wasn't a door key. It looked like a padlock key. I looked at the bung, the wooden plug that sealed the barrel. Over it was a small metal clasp, locked with a miniature padlock. No other barrel had this device. McAllister stepped behind me. That barrel is not for sale, he said softly. I know, I said. I inserted the silver key from the safe into the padlock. It turned stiffly, then clicked open. I pulled off the clasp. Then I pried the wooden bung loose. I expected the scent of whiskey to hit me immediately, but it didn't. I shone a flashlight into the hole. There was no liquid in the barrel. Instead, resting on the bottom of the dry barrel, was a plastic waterproof bag. I reached in, my arms scraping against the rough wood. I grabbed the bag and pulled it out. It was dusty, but tightly sealed. I opened it. It wasn't money. It wasn't documents. It was a VHS tape. I held it up to the light. On the label was Catherine's distinct handwriting. The ink had faded, but it was still legible. For Jack, watch me after you have won. I felt a lump in my throat. A VHS tape. It made perfect sense. In 1985, this was cutting-edge technology. She had recorded this 40 years ago. She had put it in this barrel, sealed it away, and waited. She had waited a lifetime just for me to find it. I looked at the tape in my hands. It felt incredibly heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. This was her final voice, her final instruction. McAllister cleared his throat. There is a VCR in the library upstairs, he said. I've kept it in good working order. She told me I had to make sure of that. I clutched the tape to my chest. I felt a sudden surge of nerves. I had faced my children. I had faced the police. I had faced the reality of losing my family. But listening to Catherine's voice from beyond the grave felt like the hardest thing of all. What if she was disappointed in me? What if she knew all along that I would hesitate? But then I remembered the note. Watch me after you have won. I had won. I had survived the trap. I had protected the legacy. I turned to McAllister. Let's go upstairs, I said. I want to hear what she has to say. The VCR emitted a mechanical hum, sounding like a time machine powering up. It was a sound I hadn't heard in decades. I sat in the leather armchair in the library, my hands gripping the armrests so hard the leather creaked in protest. McAllister stood by the window, giving me space, but I could feel his presence like a silent guardian. The TV screen flickered with static, and after a few seconds of black and white snow, the picture stabilized, and the image instantly sucked the air from my lungs. It was her. It was Catherine. But this wasn't the Catherine I had buried last week. This was Catherine in 1985. She was in her wedding dress, her veil pushed back over her dark, curly hair. There wasn't a single wrinkle on her face, and her eyes sparkled with mischief and energy. She held a glass of cheap champagne sitting on the edge of a hotel bed. The timestamp in the corner of the screen flickered. June 15th, 1985. Our wedding night. Hello, Jack, the young Catherine said. She leaned in close to the camera, whispering like she was sharing the biggest secret in the world. If you're watching this, it means two things. First, it means we did it. You put up with 40 years of my craziness. Second, it means I'm dead. Because honestly, as long as I'm alive, I would never let you see this. You would definitely try to talk me out of it. I laughed through my tears. She was right. I definitely would have. The camera on the screen shifted slightly, as if she were adjusting her position. Listen to me, Jack, she continued, her voice turning serious. Today we said, for richer or for poorer. But I have a hunch we're going to do pretty well on the richer part. I just made an investment, a crazy investment. I bought a ghost distillery in Scotland. Everyone says I'm insane. They say there's no market for whiskey anymore. But I have a gut feeling, Jack. This is our safety net. Not for us, but for you. The screen flickered violently. The image tore and distorted, tracking lines rolling up the screen. When the picture stabilized again, the hotel room was gone. The wedding dress was gone. Instead, it was the familiar background of our Seattle living room. The date stamp read, November 2023, 2 months before she passed away. The contrast was physically painful. Catherine sat in her favorite chair, a blanket draped over her frail legs. Her hair was thin and gray, her cheeks hollow from her brave battle with the illness. But her eyes, those eyes hadn't changed at all. They were still fierce, intelligent, and uncompromising. Jack, old Catherine spoke, her voice raspy but still powerful. If you're watching this, then the worst-case scenario has happened. The vultures are circling, and I know exactly who they are. Brian and Emily. She paused, taking a breath, a rattling sound coming from her chest. I need you to listen to me very carefully, my love, because what I'm about to say is going to hurt, but I'm saying this to save you. I know you, Jack. You're the kindest man I've ever met. You're gentle. You're forgiving. You're a builder who always wants to fix everything and mend everyone. She leaned forward, close to the camera. But you have a fatal flaw, Jack. You're an enabler. You can't say no to the people you love. You let Brian do whatever he wanted his whole life. Every time he fell, you bailed him out. You let Emily use you as an ATM because you thought buying her things would make her happy. I flinched. It was true. It was a brutal, piercing truth, one I'd spent my whole life running away from. I knew this day would come, she continued. I knew that when I was gone, there would be no one left to play the bad cop. No one left to protect you from being devoured by their greed. You have to understand, Jack. Our children are like me. They have my ambition. They have my hunger for more. But they inherited the worst parts of me. They have ambition, but they're lazy. They want the rewards, but they don't want to do the work. If I'm not there to watch over them, they'll try to eat you alive. She wiped a tear from her cheek on the screen. That's why I made that wager. That's why I hid the money. I wasn't keeping it from you. I was keeping it for you. I knew that if I let you touch that $30 million while I was alive, you would have given it to them. You would have paid off Brian's debts. You would have bought Emily another house, and they wouldn't have learned a thing. They would have squeezed us dry and left us with nothing but heartbreak. She looked straight into the camera, her gaze reaching across time. So I had to be the villain. I had to be the eccentric, secretive wife. I had to set this trap. Because I knew the only way you would survive after I was gone was by seeing who they really were with your own eyes. You needed to be backed into a corner, Jack. You needed to feel the anger. You needed to find your backbone again. I looked at her face, the woman who had played a 40-year game of chess against her own flesh and blood just to save her husband. You won that wager, Jack, she said softly. But the prize wasn't the whiskey. The prize wasn't the money. The prize is your freedom. You are finally free from the obligation of having to save people who don't want to be saved. You're free to live the life we used to talk about. Go travel, build something new, and be the man I fell in love with. The strong man, not the doormat. The video began to dim. Old Catherine offered a weak but triumphant smile. I love you, Jack Reynolds. I love you enough to lie to you. I love you enough to make you wait this long. Now go out there and live. Don't look back. And for heaven's sake, make sure you drink a few glasses of that good stuff. The screen went completely black. Then static snow filled the room again, hissing with white noise. I sat there for a long time, staring at the gray grain. The silence in the room was absolute. But in my mind, the storm that had been raging finally cleared. Now I understood everything. Every argument we'd had about money, every time she'd refused to help Brian, every time she'd scolded me for spoiling Emily. It wasn't stinginess. It was strategy. For 40 years, she had been building me a fortress, brick by brick, waiting for the day I'd need it most. She had been willing to sacrifice her image in my eyes. She had made me think she was difficult. She had made me think she kept secrets. All of it was to ensure that when I was finally alone, I would be standing on solid ground. I reached out and pressed the eject button. The tape slid out with a mechanical click. I held it for a moment, feeling the temperature of the plastic casing. "Thank you, Catherine," I whispered. I stood up. My knees didn't creak. My back was straight. The heaviness I'd felt since the funeral, since the moment Brian proposed selling the house, vanished into thin air. I walked to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtains. Outside, the storm had passed. The Scottish Highlands were bathed in a pale, cold sunlight, illuminating the rugged beauty of the land. It was harsh, yes, but it was sturdy. It was enduring. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I didn't see a pathetic 71-year-old widower who had lost his family. I saw a man who had survived a siege. I saw a man worth $30 million. But more importantly, I saw a man who was finally free. McAllister had been watching me the whole time. He poured 2 fresh glasses of the Alt Abhaine 1985. He handed one to me. "To Catherine," he said. I took the glass. I looked at the liquid gold, the legacy she had left me. "To Catherine," I said, my voice strong and clear, "and to the future." I downed it. It tasted like fire, like honey. It tasted like life. I turned from the window. "McAllister," I said, setting the glass down, "call the contractors. Call the security firm. Call the real estate agents. I'm buying all the land surrounding this estate. If we're going to start a new life, we're going to build it big enough. I'm Jack Reynolds, and I'm just getting started. If you enjoyed this story about justice and hard-won freedom, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments, what is the biggest sacrifice someone has made for you? See you in the next story. Stay strong. It has been 6 months since I first walked through the rotting gates of the Alt Abhaine estate. Back then I was a fugitive, shivering in a coat too thin for a Scottish winter, hiding from the only family I had left. Today the gates are open, but they aren't rotting anymore. We replaced the oak beams. We repaired the stone exterior. Most importantly, we brought life back to this place. The air that once smelled of mildew is now filled with laughter, the crisp clink of crystal glasses, and the rich, complex aroma of the world's finest whiskey. I'm standing on the terrace overlooking the Highlands. The heather is in bloom, staining the mountains in vibrant shades of purple and gold. Behind me, in the banquet hall, a group of whiskey connoisseurs from Japan is bidding on barrel 42. McAllister is presiding over the auction. He's more than just a lawyer to me now, he's my business partner. Angus is there too. He's wearing a suit that finally fits, in charge of the security team. He still doesn't talk, but he doesn't need to. His presence alone is enough to command absolute respect. We've turned the estate into an exclusive tasting venue. It's by invitation only. People fly in from all over the world, not just to taste the liquid gold Catherine left behind, but to hear the story of a woman who placed a bet on her own husband. My phone vibrates in my pocket. I pull it out. The screen lights up, displaying a number I have memorized, but will never answer. Caller ID, Federal Correctional Institution. It's Brian. It's Tuesday, which means it's his scheduled call time. He calls every week. McAllister tells me Brian tries to get me to pay for his appeals. He claims he's changed. He claims he found faith. He claims he's sorry. I look at the phone. My thumb hovers over the reject button. 6 months ago, my hand would have been shaking. I would have felt guilty. I would have wondered if I were a terrible father. But today my hand is steady as a rock. I'm not punishing him. I'm just refusing to participate in his self-destruction any longer. I refuse to be the safety net that catches him every time he jumps off a cliff. I press the side button, muting the call. I slide the phone back into my pocket. I don't feel anger. I don't feel sadness. I feel a sense of calm. For a man who spent his whole life walking on eggshells, it's a wonderful feeling. I turn back to the table on the terrace. There sits a glass of Alta Bain, 1985. It catches the sunlight, shimmering like a captured star. I pick it up. The liquid is thick and viscous, exactly as a 40-year-aged spirit should be. I think of Emily. The last I heard, she was working as a receptionist at a dental office in Ohio, living in a small apartment. She lost her real estate license. She lost her Porsche. She lost her status. But McAllister tells me that for the first time in her life, she is actually earning her own living and paying her own bills. Maybe in 10 years she'll understand. Maybe she never will. That's no longer a burden I have to carry. I swirl the whiskey in the glass. I gaze at the horizon where the rugged mountains meet the sky. I used to think building skyscrapers was my legacy. I wanted to build things that reached the clouds. But I realize now that the most important thing a person can build is their own self-respect. Catherine gave me the bricks, but I had to mix the mortar myself. I take a sip. The flavors explode on my tongue. Honey, smoke, dried apricots, and a finish that seems to go on forever. It's the taste of patience. It's the taste of a hard-won victory. I understand now that we use the word family too loosely. We think it means biological ties. We think it means DNA passed down through generations. But I've learned the truth. Family is not just the blood in your veins. Family is who stands by you when the walls come crashing down. Family is who hands you a flashlight when you are in the dark. Angus is my family. McAllister is my family. And Catherine, though she is gone, will always be the backbone of this family. Sometimes you have to prune the branches to save the tree. You have to cut off the dead wood so the trunk can survive. It was a painful gardening session, but an absolutely necessary one. I had to protect myself from my own flesh and blood in order to survive. Standing here, breathing this clean air, I know I made the right choice. I raise my glass to the empty chair across from me. It's Catherine's chair. It always will be. "You were right, my love," I whisper to the wind. "The view up here really is magnificent." I finish my drink and set the glass down. The auction inside is over. I hear applause. Another barrel sold. Another $1 million into the foundation, the one I started to help other victims of domestic financial abuse. I straighten my coat. I have guests to host. I have business to run. I have a life to experience, a life that is finally, completely my own. I'm Jack Reynolds, and I'm 71 years old, and for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. This story is a brutal reminder. Unconditional love does not mean unconditional tolerance. Many of us are taught that we must support family no matter what, even if they abuse us, exploit us, or threaten our safety. But Jack's story teaches us that setting boundaries is an act of self-respect. Enabling a toxic person isn't love, it's just participating in their dysfunction. True wealth isn't the number in your bank account. It's the freedom of waking up every morning without fear. Never set yourself on fire just to keep others warm. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear these words. Maybe you know a Jack still trapped in a cage. Help them find their key. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories on justice, resilience, and the human spirit. Leave a comment below. Tell me the hardest boundary you've ever had to set with family. I read every single one.